Good evening, everybody. My name's Maria Lee, and I am co-convener and co-editor of UCL's Current Legal Problems lecture series and publication. The Faculty of Law has been hosting these lectures since 1948, so it's a real privilege to share the role of convening them now. And my job today is just to welcome you all to UCL Faculty of Laws, to welcome those joining us online. I'm absolutely delighted that Ben Yong is our lecturer today, and I'm really excited to hear about his timely and important work on the civil service. I'm also delighted to be able to introduce our chair, Sir Jonathan Jones, KCB, Honorary KC. Jonathan was a government lawyer for over 30 years. That included roles as Home Office Legal Advisor, Director General of the Attorney General's Office, and latterly Treasury Solicitor and Permanent Secretary of the Government Legal Department. Jonathan joined Linklaters LLP as a senior consultant in 2020, where his work includes judicial review and public law generally, advice on legal policy, constitutional developments, the workings of government and parliament, and public and parliamentary inquiries. Jonathan's also Senior Fellow of the Institute for Government, Honorary Senior Fellow of the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and a visiting professor at Durham Law School. And with that, I have nothing more to say. I will hand over to Jonathan's capable chairing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ben Yong. If you look at Ben's blue sky profile, for those of you that follow such things, and you should follow Ben if you do, you'll see that he quotes me describing him as estimable. When I saw he'd done that, I felt I'd better go and check that it meant what I thought it meant. And it wasn't one of those words like fulsome or enormity that doesn't mean quite what you think. Anyway, it does mean that. And he really is worthy of great respect and admiration. Ben is a public lawyer. His research focuses on the work of the executive and parliament, the role of officials, and, his words, the maintenance of ideals in the grubbiness of organisations. Ben joined Durham Law School as an associate professor in public law and human rights in September 2019. He obtained his PhD from the LSE and LLM from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He previously worked at the Constitution Unit, UCL here, and was a teaching fellow in public law at UCL. Then also worked at the UK Ministry of Justice in 2010 on the UK Cabinet Manual. Prior to joining Durham, Ben was a lecturer in public law at Queen Mary and then at the University of Hull Law School. Ben has an eclectic range of research interests, including coalition government, special advisors, legislative governance and parliamentary administration, how legislatures are run, government lawyers and parliamentary lawyers, and the sociology of judges. So basically really all the good stuff, you might think, for those people like me anyway. Ben's current research projects include the bureaucratic impartiality of officials, legislative government and parliamentary administration, the nature of parliament, and the role of the civil service in the Constitution. He's won 2 external grants to look at the work of parliamentary officials. He's published a book on special advisors with Robert Hazel and studies of government lawyers and parliamentary lawyers. And most recently, he published the 3rd edition of Parliament and the Law with Alex Horne and Louise Thompson. That's the only text dealing with Parliament and its relationship to the law, and leading works in public law with Patrick O'Brien. So anyway, I know Ben has thought very, very deeply about the role of the civil service, its place in the Constitution, and its relationship with the other branches of the state. These are highly topical questions at a time of great political turbulence and uncertainty, and there's no better person to talk to us about them. So over to Ben.
Right. Thank you, Maria, for inviting me, and to Jonathan for the lovely introduction. So I guess I should say a little bit about how I came to come onto this topic. as Jonathan was saying, I wrote a book on special advisors with Robert, and I did a little bit of work on government lawyers. And at the time I thought, well, I've said all that needs to be said quite arrogantly. And I should really say, I thought I had said all I wanted to say. And I moved on to Parliament for a decade, really, another very strange institution. And one of the questions that kept coming up with Parliament was, to whom do officials owe their loyalty? And a decade later, I think I worked out the answer for Parliament. So when Maria gave me this invite for a public lecture, I thought, well, I'll look at something easier. I'll look at the duty of loyalty of officials to the executive. And I thought, no problem. And I regret my life choices, a few months later, but here we are. Anyway, so I'll get started. In 2019, Prime Minister Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament so that he could get Brexit done and avoid scrutiny and obstruction by Remainer MPs. And since then, there have been a number of revelations about what was going on behind the scenes. And maybe the most interesting revelation from my point of view were discussions that were had by Johnson and his then Chief Special Advisor, Dominic Cummings, to circumvent the European Union Withdrawal Number 2 Act 2019, the Ben Act. And under certain conditions, the Ben Act required Johnson to seek an extension to Brexit by a particular deadline. And Cummings and Johnson, Cummings actually suggested, well, why don't we just ignore the deadline? Why don't we just ignore the Act? And when he was told that the police might come for them for non-compliance, Cummings and Johnson both kind of mused aloud that they could barricade themselves at number 10 and the police would have to drag them out. And it would be the perfect kind of photo opportunity. It would show that Johnson's had a determination to get Brexit done. But Helen McNamara, who was a senior civil servant at the time and Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet, warned them that the civil service wouldn't protect them in such a situation. And she said, the police don't work for you in that situation, Tom. They work for us. It's not your building. These aren't your people. The police work for the Queen. We all work for the Queen. And the idea was quietly dropped, and Johnson ultimately asked for an extension. And so there are various ways in which we can frame the story. And the obvious way that public lawyers would frame the story is to emphasize the role of the civil service as enforcing constitutionality and legality, as a kind of constitutional guardian. McNamara and the others warned Johnson and his advisors a number of times. They counseled him about the consequences of breaching the law. Ultimately, Johnson complied with the law in good sense, validating the role of the civil service as a constitutional backstop. But there's another framing, which is to stress how much officials actually supported Johnson. For instance, Johnson asked the then Attorney General to withhold information from Cabinet about his concerns about the legality of prorogation. And one official justified this, saying that Johnson was only briefing Cabinet. It wasn't a meeting in which Cabinet was making a decision. And whatever you think about the plausibility of that argument, we should just note that how much officials were straining to support the Prime Minister and his government. And McNamara, for instance, continued to support Johnson in number 10 throughout the COVID-19 crisis. And so the strangeness of that Janus-like nature of the civil service prompts us to ask, well, what is the role of the civil service in a democracy, and what are the limits of this role? And it's surprising how rarely public lawyers, anyway, have addressed these questions. And they're big questions, really, but they are worth asking, not least because of the times that we live in. We face a moment where faith in democracy and established institutions seems at a particularly low ebb. And democratic backsliding, the weakening or evisceration of institutions designed to sustain democracy, seems to be on the rise. And intermediary institutions like the bureaucracy is seen as obstructing populist politicians who portray themselves as the direct representatives of the people. So here's my argument. The doctrine of ministerial responsibility is the dominant constitutional principle underpinning the work of the civil service. And it appeals to public lawyers, it appeals to politicians and the public, because it appears to reconcile the role of the civil service within the traditional framework of the separation of powers and parliamentary sovereignty. And it follows that the primary duty of civil servants is to support the incumbent government. But ministerial responsibility leaves little or no space for the possibility that the civil service might have duties to the continuity of the state, which is separate from its duty to support the incumbent government. And that, coupled with the deliberate ambiguity of the law of the civil service, seems to me to leave the civil service vulnerable to a government intent on democratic backsliding. Okay, so the modern state is so complex, really, that elected politicians can't do everything. Delegation is inevitable, and that means we need a bureaucracy to support them. But from its inception, a key problem has been finding a balance between the need to maintain the autonomy of the bureaucracy and ensuring democratic control over it. And Max Weber, who's a towering figure in the study of bureaucracy, argued that bureaucracy was a technically efficient instrument of administration, and its key characteristics were, a hierarchy of officers, expertise, the full-time commitment of officials, a system of stable and general rules. All of these characteristics made it superior to any other form of organization. They ensured unity, precision and speed, impartiality, and institutional memory and continuity across government. And no one has really shown that the quality of life that citizens demand in a modern democracy can really be sustained without bureaucracy. But Weber emphasized that bureaucracy was only technically efficient, that bureaucracy had a tendency to extend its own power and become a separate force in society. And Weber feared that really what would happen would be that bureaucracy would over time usurp the role of the politician, because expertise creates its own power, and the dilettantism of the politician couldn't really compete with the expertise of the bureaucrat. So Weber was highly ambivalent about bureaucracy. It increased our capability to meet our desired collective ends, but he also feared bureaucracy would colonize everything. It needed to be balanced and kept under control by politicians. And that question of finding the balance between autonomy and control remains today, and there's never really been a conclusive answer to this question. But lately, a new question has emerged. So Francis Fukuyama has said recently, and he talks about this balance between autonomy and control, but he says it sidesteps the tricky political question of bureaucratic autonomy in situations where the political principle is manifestly incompetent, corrupt, or is acting in something other than the public interest. And he's talking about democratic backsliding, which is the state-led rehabilitation or the elimination of the institutions which sustain an existing democracy. It involves unprincipled political principles, politicians, deliberately undermining key aspects of liberal democracy, including the electoral process and established institutions that serve to check or at least stabilize executive power. And democratic backsliding is particularly pernicious because it relies, it's legitimated by the very institutions that democracy promoters have prioritized. Elections, majority voting through legislatures and courts, and the laws that are passed by majorities. And backsliding is often linked to populism, which divides society into a pure people and a corrupt elite. Populist governments often push to undermine and remove institutions which frustrate the will of the people, those intermediary institutions which check or at least stabilize executive power. And one of those institutions is the bureaucracy. And the most stark and disquieting example of backsliding is happening right now in the US. And their change has really been, has historically served to foreground, or foreshadow, I should say, changes in other so-called established Western democracies. And their key attacks on key institutions have advanced with quite alarming rapidity. And what's been striking in both the first and the second Trump administration has been the assault on the federal civil service. But there's also been some concerns about the direction of travel in the UK, with various institutions subtly and not so subtly undermined and attacked in recent years. There were attacks on judges as enemies of the people after the Miller 1 judgment. Last week, there was an opposition politician who called for root and branch changes to the appointment and removal procedures for judges that made bad decisions about immigration. There was the attempt to probe Parliament, changes to the Electoral Commission, and there's been sustained criticism of the civil service, either because it's been seen as obstructionist or as ineffective in delivering government policy, or both. It's been seen as part of the blob, as part of the so-called deep state, what we used to call just the state. And it's set against democratically elected politicians. Now, we don't have to take a firm position on whether or not democratic backsliding is happening in the UK, but we can note that it is happening elsewhere, and it might be worth us taking a kind of stock take. How would the civil service respond to a populist government intent on democratic backsliding? Because some, in contrast to Weber, some scholars are now arguing that actually they portray the bureaucracy as a check on the passions or the whims of charismatic politicians. And some suggest that the bureaucracy should not simply resist unprincipled politicians, but actually, under certain circumstances, actively protect democracy. Are there resources within public law that civil servants might draw upon? Well, one problem is that public lawyers have generally left the field of bureaucracy. It's more of a general problem that public lawyers have with the executive. They tend to see the executive as not really worthy of interest. They're more interested in looking at it. If they look at the executive, they look at it from the point of view of the other two branches of government, Parliament and the courts. So administrative law, for instance, is not really the law of the administration, it's the law directed against the administration. Timothy Endicott talks of the stubborn stain theory of the executive. Executive power is seen as a stain that needs to be washed out of the fabric of the Constitution. But there are also theoretical issues surrounding the executive which make it quite difficult for public lawyers. The public law of the executive obscures really the weird multivalence of the executive. There's the creaking doctrine of the indivisibility of the Crown, all the ways in which the UK executive continues to be seen as unitary, say through collective cabinet responsibility, or the Carl-Toner doctrine, when its plural nature continues to plague successive governments that are in pursuit of collective action. And Terence Dainton and Alan Page have talked about this, so has the Institute for Government. There are also practical and methodological problems for lawyers that want to study the executive. You just need a lot of time to figure out what's going on. There are problems of access because the executive is generally quite secretive about what it's doing. And much of what governs the executive doesn't really look like law. It's guidance or codes or circulars. And lawyers aren't comfortable with that. But there are also two specific reasons why the civil service hasn't really been looked at by public lawyers. The separation of powers doctrine, which is the kind of broad framework for public law, developed prior to the growth of bureaucracy, which meant that bureaucracy often stands or sits quite awkwardly in descriptions of constitutional arrangements. It's sometimes seen as a fourth branch, or it's seen as a delegate of one of the other two branches of government, or a delegate of both. Janet McLean and Mark Tushnet have noted that if you look at constitutions written before the 20th century, they're usually silent on the role of the administration. But the other reason the civil service has been ignored in public law is the advent of democracy and ministerial responsibility, which is the doctrine which has really been retrofitted to explain the role and work of the civil service. So elected officials, politicians decide, and unelected officials implement, or just advise and implement. It's a kind of transmission belt theory. And on this view, the civil service is merely the agent of a set of political principles. And it provides a simple view of bureaucracy, which sits quite neatly within our common sense understanding of what democracy is, or ought to be. We elect politicians, politicians decide, officials simply implement or obey. So there's a neat chain of delegation. Ministerial responsibility then serves as a kind of description of practice, but also as a normative justification for how the bureaucracy is controlled. But the surface simplicity of ministerial responsibility really hides the complexity of what the civil service is and what it does. Ministerial responsibility presumes this distinct divide between politics and administration, between ends and means. Officials are secondary because they're responsible for means, and means are secondary. So on this view, civil servants have little or no discretion. But the idea that civil servants have no discretion or role in the policy process is just unrealistic. A ministerial decision, if there is one, is just one stage amongst many in the policy-making process. And at almost every stage of this process, officials are exercising discretion. So instructions from ministers, for instance, are rarely specific enough to guide officials, and there can be cross-cutting issues, which mean there's discussion between departments, and the detail isn't just detail. It can determine the entire policy and how it's perceived and how it works in practice. Moreover, as Bernardo Zacca has said, ministerial responsibility ignores the role of values and how those enter into the process of discretion. So compliance with statute will often require discretion because statutory language is open-ended and there can be disagreement about appropriate means. Values are important. It's not just what the state does, but how it does it. And Joe Tomlinson has given a lecture here about how public services influence our understandings of the legitimacy of the state. We expect the state to provide services in a way that upholds democratic culture. So, I guess what I'm saying is that ministerial responsibility is a bit like the civil service analogue of parliamentary sovereignty in UK constitutional law. So, the democratic credentials of Parliament are such that there can't be really any constraint on what Parliament can do. Once Parliament has spoken, that's the end of the matter. And similarly, the democratic credentials of ministers are such that the determination of the public interest is decisive. The civil service can't look outside the incumbent government to seek an independent understanding of the public interest. Their only role is to implement the will of ministers. Criticisms of ministerial responsibility like this are nothing new. They've been around for ages. But in spite of this, as Janet McLean argues, we continue to see the authority of the administration, the role of the civil service, as largely based on its role to support ministers. There's a very limited sense in which the civil service has an important role in government and the Constitution because of its institutional values, that it provides expertise and competence, that it adheres to legality, that it provides due process and impartiality. And actually, these alternative sources of authority are also under attack. The civil service is not really thought of these days in public discourse as having expertise. That's why there's a lot of outsourcing going on, apparently. And it's often criticized for its sluggishness and its insistence on legality, that's stopping and obstructing policy from happening. Okay, so does the internal law of the civil service offer anything which might help? Well, it reflects its constitutional underpinnings. It's driven by an insistence upon responsiveness to ministers. Examined more closely, though, this internal law seems to have various qualifications and ambiguities. So the current law of the civil service is a mixture of statute, convention, prerogative, codes, internal guidance. And I'll just look at a couple. In 2010, the management of the civil service was largely put on a statutory footing through the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, CRAG. CRAG, however, is a very bare bones discussion or codification of practice. It just states that the civil service is managed by a minister of the civil service, that civil servants are appointed on merit, that there should be a civil service code which form part of the terms and conditions of officials, terms of service, and that it must be published, and that there are minimal requirements for the code. That's basically it. The Civil Service Code, on the other hand, adds a little bit of flesh to the impoverished provisions of CRAG, but it has quite an odd legal status because it's an instrument issued under CRAG. And there are three relevant sections here. The first section states, this is the first section, by the way, the first section states that civil servants are accountable to ministers who are in turn accountable to Parliament. So again, what's emphasised is this overarching doctrine of ministerial responsibility. And in the recent FDA case, which concerned the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Act, Justice Chamberlain said that the code's provisions needed to be interpreted within its constitutional context, of which the key rule was ministerial responsibility. The second section sets out the core values of the civil service, so integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. And it's the third section, entitled Political Impartiality, which is maybe the most nuanced of the three sections. And I won't read it out, but you can read it if you want. We can note three matters. First, the section is a directive of self-denial. It emphasizes the subordination of the official's own political views to those of the politician. As Max Weber said, when an official receives an order, his honor lies in his ability to carry it out, exactly as if it corresponded to his own convictions. Even if the order seems wrong to him, without this discipline and self-denial, the entire apparatus would collapse. Second, the section is an instruction of responsiveness, the readiness of civil servants to do what the incumbent government wants. And it's the primary duty of the civil service. That said, responsiveness can be complicated. To begin with, responsiveness to who? Is it to the department, the minister of the department, or is it to the government as a whole? Moreover, responsiveness isn't just about acceding to direct instructions. It may mean looking past the minister's immediate wants and needs and thinking about those wants and needs which are temporarily eclipsed in the moment. In other words, responsiveness can be about thinking about the short-term and the long-term needs of the government or the minister. So again, the civil service has a little more discretion that is suggested by ministerial responsibility. Finally, the section qualifies the primary obligation of responsiveness in two ways. The first provision states that officials must be responsive, but in a way that maintains political impartiality and is consistent with the civil service's core values. So for instance, under integrity, civil servants have to comply with the law. Under objectivity, civil servants are expected to provide advice which is evidence-based. They can't just make things up. And these civil service values are really one qualification on the primary principle of responsiveness. And Richard Mulligan refers to this qualification as the principle of public integrity. The second provision points to another limit on responsiveness, the principle of constrained partisanship. So officials have to be responsive to present-day ministers, but their actions should not affect any relationship that they might have with future ministers. So there's a limit to the degree of support they can offer to any one government. So it involves pragmatic calculations about the effects of appearances. Too much support for an incumbent government might undermine confidence that the civil service could support a future government as well. And these various strictures in the Civil Service Code are enforced by provisions in the Ministerial Code. And it's the last code I'll be talking about, I promise. The Ministerial Code states that ministers have a duty to give fair consideration to the advice that's given by civil servants, that they have to uphold political impartiality, and they shouldn't ask civil servants to act in a way which would conflict with the Civil Service Code. But ministerial compliance with the Ministerial Code is essentially just convention. It's not in statute. So the internal law of the civil service makes it clear that the primary duty of civil servants is to be responsive to the incumbent government. And much of what is popularly portrayed as speaking truth to power or free and frank advice is really just being responsive to the entire needs of the minister, not just in the short term, but also in the medium and long term. Responsiveness is qualified by these principles of public integrity and constrained partisanship, which both demand a distance from the incumbent government. But if Justice Chamberlain and FDA was right, the code still needs to be interpreted in line with the core constitutional principle, ministerial responsibility, so that any tension between those principles of integrity and of constrained partisanship are likely to be resolved in favour of ministers. Okay, so the internal law of the civil service largely focuses on responsiveness, and it's not a strong basis for a civil service facing a populist government. And yet there remains this kind of nagging belief that the civil service and its resources are not entirely at ministers' disposal. It's often expressed as the civil service having a separate constitutional personality or having a higher duty to the Crown, which is something separate from the incumbent government. And all that comes out in various ways. So for instance, when a general election approaches, there can be pre-election contacts between the civil service and key opposition parties. There's purdah, which means that the government should be very careful about how it uses the government publicity machine for its own electoral advantage, and the civil service has to kind of police that. There's the accounting officer regime, in which usually its permanent secretaries are personally responsible for the management of public money in their department. And on an everyday level, the separateness of the civil service might be seen in the principles of public integrity and the constrained partisanship principle. All of these practices demand some distance from the incumbent government, and it enforces the sense that the civil service is somehow separate from its temporary masters. This isn't surprising. Institutions will build up understandings and values which seem to persevere and outlast temporary office holders. And Hugh Hecklow called this thinking institutionally. It's about valuing continuity, the long term over the short term. It's about thinking of one's role as a profession, as an office, with reference to ethical standards and fiduciary responsibilities, and a shared normative vision. And it means stewardship. It means not guarding, but also investing in assets on behalf of those to whom the assets will be passed in the future. So just as lawyers don't just have duties to their clients, but also to the courts, we might say that the civil service have duties not just to the incumbent government, but also to something greater, the Crown. And thus, C.H. Sisson, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who was a poet and a civil servant, once said, "Our large bureaucracy is a constitutional non-entity. Our suspicion that it is nonetheless not absolutely nothing remains. And indeed, it is something." So there's a triple negative there. And you know, Sisson was a bit of a joker. There's a poem that he wrote to a civil servant. He lies a civil servant. He was civil to everyone and servant to the devil. But anyway, he did later argue that the civil service did ultimately serve something other than the incumbent government, and he called it the Crown. And from time to time, this argument has been run. And Helen McNamara's comment to Cummings and Johnson was really just the most recent example. But there are problems with seeing the civil service as having a separate constitutional personality or having a higher duty to the Crown. The first is that the narrowness of the examples that are used to demonstrate this separate personality. Many of these activities, I've just talked about some of them, government transition, are really limited in time and scope, and a lot of them actually require prime ministerial authorization. They don't really represent what the civil service does on a regular basis. The second problem is it's not really clear what the Crown is. The Crown in UK law is many things. It's a symbol, it's a person, it's the government, it's the state. And maybe what Helen McNamara was talking about was something like, I don't know, the integrity of the law. Even if we could agree that the Crown was separate from the incumbent government, it's quite difficult to determine or work out under what conditions that would actually matter, what the Crown's interests might be, and how those interests could be kept separate from the incumbent government. The argument that the civil service has a separate personality was run in the recent FDA case, which was all about, as I said, the safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Act. And given that the Act, in effect, breached international law, the question arose whether compliance with that would be in conflict with the Civil Service Code. And Justice Chamberlain was skeptical, and he didn't really answer the point because he said, I just don't know what a separate constitutional personality would entail. And again, he'd preferred to answer the issue by reference to key propositions within the Constitution, of which the most important was that ministers decide government policy and the role of officials is to advise and implement policy, ministerial responsibility. The final problem is that successive ministers and senior civil servants have actually worked to downplay any sense of a separate personality or a higher duty. The classic statement of this is the 1985 Armstrong Memorandum, and it's on Martin's website. And following the acquittal of Clyde Ponting, who was a civil servant at the time, who leaked government information, Lord Armstrong, who was then the cabinet secretary, was prompted to draft a memorandum about the role of the civil service. And he argued civil servants are servants of the Crown. For all practical purposes, the Crown in this context means the government of the day. The civil service as such has no constitutional personality. So he was denying both that the civil service had a separate constitutional personality or that the Crown was something separate from the incumbent government. And what's striking is how historically the civil service has largely worked to paper over any kind of tension between its duty of responsiveness and any separate institutional duties. So again, think of Sisson's triple negative. He's really not comfortable about talking about any additional duties. There's a studied ambiguity that goes on here, and it's a kind of prudential practice that the civil service uses to finesse its fragile role within government. And this is Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government. Rather than wanting more clarity in principles, officials are far more likely to defend the necessary shade within them. The principle exists, but doing the job is something else. Silence and ambiguity allow for flexibility, because neither ministers or officials really benefit from conflict with the other. Ministers need officials to implement, to get things done. And officials have no legitimacy without ministers. The glue that holds that relationship together is mutual trust. And explicit declarations of some higher loyalties will just weaken that trust. And a fight against ministers would be very harmful to the civil service. The civil service would lose not just with ministers of the incumbent government, but with those from a future government. So institutional thinking is crowded out by this sense of responsiveness. This prudential practice of silence has costs. It means a lack of certainty and transparency over the rules, and it emphasizes expediency over principle. And it presumes that the civil service has the capability, really, to continue to manage that ambiguity, and that ministers, present and future, are actually willing to tolerate ambiguity. Okay, so how would the civil service, respond to a populist government that came to power with an agenda to democratic backsliding, to engage in democratic backsliding? Let's call this populist government Transform. And it has a small majority in the Commons, and it shares a similar agenda to the Trump administration. So a hostility to expertise and diversity, and an intolerance to established institutions. I'm going to ignore substantive policy change like leaving the ECHR, and just focus on the impact on the civil service. So traditionally, the civil service has preferred to manage the executive has chosen to manage the civil service by non-legislative means, even leaving Craig aside, because it allows for flexibility. And what seems like, what seems like a strength becomes a problem if you get a government that is intent on democratic backsliding. And there are lots of non-legislative changes that could be done. So there could be the alteration of structures and the redistribution of resources, personnel changes, the overhaul of bureaucratic norms. And I'll just go through a couple of them. Most of these could be fairly easily done, I think. Most would be legal. And it would be difficult to describe them as undemocratic. That's the problem with democratic backsliding, is that a lot of the changes will be advertised as making things more democratic. Government departments can be relatively easily modified or even abolished. Very costly, but it can be done with limited parliamentary scrutiny. Transform could carry out wide-scale redundancies. By statute, civil servants have the same rights as private employees, but during the coalition, they got rid of 100,000 civil servants. Officials can be shifted around, redeployed, sidelined, or constructively dismissed. We can think about Sir Tom Scholar, the then Permanent Secretary to the Treasury under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Whatever the formalities, if a minister doesn't want an official, the official has to leave. The number of special advisors, or SPADs, could be drastically increased because there's no statutory cap on the number. And while under Cragg, SPADs can't order officials to do anything, if you get large numbers, they could probably end up controlling access to the minister. Transform could also introduce outsiders through the exceptional route for a time-limited period under Cragg. Guidance and the orientation of the civil service could also be changed with relative ease. Esther McVeigh, who was the minister for the Cabinet Office, introduced new guidance that stopped all external spending on equality, diversity, and inclusion activity. Suella Braverman, of course, published changes to the legal guidance on legal risk. because she was worried that government lawyers were being too cautious and blocking policy. Transform ministers could simply sideline or just ignore the work of civil servants. I mean, the odd rejection is fine and legitimate, but what about blanket rejection? All of this is just ministerial acceptance of the work of the civil service is largely taken for granted, really, but a lot of it is just convention. How would officials respond to such changes? Everything is going to depend on the concrete particulars, but there would be a kind of spectrum of responses. FDA, the case, established that the civil servants could refuse to comply with illegal actions which are illegal under domestic law. But the more likely or difficult example is going to be where you get a transformed minister giving a completely legal instruction which is unambiguously bad in the sense of damaging the government in the short or long term. So what would happen? Well, one answer is responsiveness. That will be the default response. Officials will just attempt to clarify what was being said and flesh out what the minister wanted, and they would generally try to implement the policy, perhaps on the belief that, as the policy worked its way through the government, the weaknesses would be exposed and would be remedied. Depending on the nature of the instruction, it might end up being escalated to the law officers if there was an issue of legality. If there was a conflict with the Civil Service Code, it might end up ultimately with the Civil Service Commission. The Permanent Secretary as accounting officer might have a say in this if it involved public money. But all of these are quite rare. On the other hand, where there's a new government, it's not uncommon for civil servants to be over-responsive to prove they can work with their new masters. And the civil service doesn't just work on direct instructions. They get cues and stares, and over time, they might get the stare that certain kinds of considerations are not really appropriate, and over time, these might be left out of advice. A more serious step would be guerrilla government, which is the bureaucratic shirking, leaking, and whistleblowing. And all these actions go against the grain of the civil service. And there's a specific provision in the civil service saying that officials shouldn't frustrate the implementation of policies. The most formal means of resistance is resignation. Elizabeth Wilmhurst, who resigned, for instance, from the FCO over the advice given about the legality of the invasion of Iraq. More recently, various things. So in America, the Center for Disease Control, a lot of officials resigned after the new head was fired. So all of these things can happen. But guerrilla government and resignation present two dilemmas. First, when is enough enough? These matters happen in real time, and it's difficult to tell at what point compliance becomes complicity and when it is legitimate to resist. What measures do officials have? We don't know. What's the threshold at which you can say no? And second, should one stay to ameliorate the worst of what is to come? As the good officials leave, less principled officials may start to fill the gap. Democratic backsliding can lead to bureaucratic backsliding. So, in short, come a democratically elected populist government, it's quite unclear what the civil service would be able to do at all. Its normative framework is not resistance, but responsiveness, and institutional values can only take officials so far. So what can be done? That depends on what we think the problem is and its severity. If we think the problem is a distant threat or just about improving civil service efficiency, then just tinker around the edges. But I think the problem is a little more fundamental and a little more urgent. What I've been describing is the absence of any strong normative or legal basis for the work of the civil service itself, and linked to that, the potential erosion of permanence, impartiality, and objectivity. And it's an argument that's been made many times. Harkening back to this golden age is a perennial temptation in this area. But I don't know that we can continue with the status quo anymore, because even if those who are currently intent on transforming the state in the UK seem quite amateurish, we can expect them to learn and evolve. You can think about the difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. So there's limited clarity about the role of the civil service and its relationship with ministers, and that leaves the civil service in a vulnerable position for ministers intent on democratic backsliding. Now, the civil service will almost certainly say nothing. There may be some kind of preparation behind the scenes, but it will be behind the scenes. The best they could probably do is maybe departments would focus on strengthening integrity. The question of the appropriate relationship between ministers and officials is really a political one, and resolution of this really requires consensus, because unilateral reform of the civil service by any government can easily be undone by a future government with a government majority. A more formal means would be a commission. Both the House of Commons Public Administration Committee and the UK Governance Project, which Jonathan was a member of, both suggested establishing a commission to look into the appropriate model for the civil service in the 21st century. Sounds great. The obvious problem is there's little incentive for ministers to establish a commission that might recommend reducing ministerial control over the civil service. And there's no incentive for politicians who think they might become future ministers to pay any attention to a commission either. Similar problems with putting things in statute. Okay, conclusion. The civil service has a lot more discretion than traditional public law theory allows. At best, it's a quasi-independent actor within the UK Constitution that doesn't make the civil service some kind of constitutional guardian or bulwark. And while officials can speak truth to power, there is, as Janet McLean has said, very little constitutional scaffolding. The ability of the civil service to push back and its permanence is largely based on convention and ministerial forbearance. And what legitimacy officials have is derivative on elected ministers in the first instance, on Parliament when enforcing a statute, on the courts in adhering to legality. And the civil service itself hasn't, sorry, I should have said these are the recommendations on commissions. But anyway, the civil service itself hasn't helped itself by working to obscure any clear answers. The history of the relationship between the civil service and ministers is one of trust and willingness by both sides to reach some kind of accommodation. That accommodation is fragile and contingent, and too much depends on ministers who have largely avoided defining the role of the civil service in the Constitution. And ultimately, the civil service exists as part of an ecosystem which underpins and supports democratic governance. But the existence of this ecosystem and its various constituent parts shouldn't be taken for granted. Hugh Hecklow was right. Institutions matter. And the danger in our time is not too much, but too little institutional thinking.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a masterly analysis, very sobering one, or terrifying, depending on your point of view. Now, there's time for some questions. I hope there are some questions for Ben. A few things I would like to probe him on, but you go first. And if you have a question, can you wait for the mic, please, so that those online particularly can hear?
Thanks very much. Pravar Petkar, International Centre for Sustainability. Question around the normative aspect of your argument. Civil service responsible to ministers, presumably because of ministers' democratic credentials, accountable to Parliament because of Parliament's democratic credentials. How far is the issue that we're dealing with in a British context specifically to do with how the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty seems to treat the legitimacy of Parliament, or seems to presuppose the legitimacy of Parliament, I would argue largely on the basis of elections, on the basis of the electoral system, and is rethinking the basis of Parliament's legitimacy perhaps a route to solving the normative issue and bringing in other considerations such as civil service duty up to uphold the rule of law, ensure legal compliance, and so on. Thank you.
Do you want to take a
Well, why didn't you deal with that one?
I was having to have more time to think about it, to be honest. I'm not going to answer your question the way maybe I should. I think I would say, and it's in the bigger paper, that I think there's a real problem with ministerial responsibility and the way it's become really attenuated, where we kind of presume that it's, there is that line of delegation, but the chain is not really there. You've got officials and ministers, but they're quite separate now from Parliament. And I think that to me is part of the problem, that in a way you have this doctrine of ministerial responsibility that's been hollowed out. So ministerial responsibility is now, as Mike Gordon has been saying, almost entirely personalised. Very few ministers, for instance, resign because of problems in their department. I think Amber Rudd was the last one. The majority of ministerial resignations are around personal issues. So that's one problem. I mean, and also Parliament is quite, the relationship between Parliament and officials is also quite attenuated, I think. I mean, look at the way the US motherly rules, which are, the relationship, which deals with the relationship between officials and Parliament is supposed to work. It was written by the executive. Parliament doesn't really, I don't think, has taken control of, if there is this line of delegation and Parliament is one of the delegates that should be doing more work and it's not. And so I suppose you're right. Part of the argument should be to kind of press on the legitimacy or the kind of plausibility of ministerial responsibility as a real justification. Does that? Yeah, okay, good.
Brilliant.
Thanks. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, Ben. I really enjoyed it. It's really interesting, though, that of all the institutions available, you're looking at the civil service. I kind of respect that because I think the civil service is more fundamental than we acknowledge popularly. And we're all conscious that autocracies and dictatorships all have massive bureaucracies or can have massive bureaucracies that aren't protecting democracy. And I suppose it links into your answer to the last question, which is whether we're looking in the right place, if we're looking at the civil service as a bulwark against democratic backsliding. And I mean, I'm thinking as well as Parliament about local government and all of those bits of democratic thinking all the way up and down the state that we don't think about very often. So, just thought.
Yes. I'm trying to think how to answer this. I guess, I think you're right. I mean, what doesn't come out, I think, in the talk is that I've kind of put out that there's a conflict between bureaucracy and democracy, and I've kind of focused on bureaucracy and said, well, there are all these myths about it, and it's not really true. And I haven't really talked about democracy and the myths surrounding that. I mean, we've started to get into it, but you're right. I mean, do we think of democracy as just, electoral success, or is it something more sophisticated, a set of mediated relationships? So, when you have policy, it goes through all kinds of different institutions before it becomes law or before it's implemented. And so you're right, we probably need to think about all of those intermediary institutions as well. And that's why at the end, I kind of saved myself by saying that the civil service is part of an ecosystem, which is to, it's not just the civil service we need to think about. It's all kinds of, I think, institutions which might support democracy, which is looking more fragile than ever. And you're right, if we focus just on the civil service, that's probably a mistake.
But we're 3 or 4 years off from the next election when your scenario might come to pass. What would you think either the civil service or the government or Parliament might do in the meantime to prepare for that scenario? I mean, there are ideas. You've mentioned some of the ideas, the Civil Service Act, some of the ideas we had in the governance project that I was a member of, would, to an extent, have involved the current government giving up some of the levers for the sake of constraining future ones. But what would we now do in the next 3 to 4 years?
I mean, if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be here. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's quite worrying. I mean, this is not the answer. This is a long-term thing, actually, that I think needs to be done, which is. So I think there's probably a whole bunch of things, and you will know that the Attorney General's office has got this rule of law unit, which is looking to kind of strengthen the rule of law in various ways within business, within communities, and national security, all kinds of things like that. So that's one approach. This is a non-legal argument. I want to say that I think one thing we're missing, and it sounds really wishy-washy and it's not legal at all, is stories. It's not. So one of the problems with democratic backsliding is it relies on a story about how the civil service is kind of this lumbering beast that just obstructs things from happening. And I think that's a story that needs to be counteracted. And for some of this is happening here at UCL actually. So Mariana Mazzucato was running at the entrepreneurial state. There's a guy also in UCL, Don Honig, who wrote a book called Mission-Led Bureaucracy, which is excellent. And it talks about how bureaucrats civil servants aren't the kind of public choice image of civil servants. They're not self-interested, trying to build their kind of empires. They're publicly minded, they're publicly spirited. And he has a great anecdote in the first chapter about how in the first Trump administration, there was also a government shutdown, and thousands of federal bureaucrats turned up anyway. Why did they turn up if they weren't getting paid? Because they believed in the public service. And that's the kind of story that needs to be told. And I think, I keep saying this to everybody, someone should write a book here, like Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, which is a defense of the federal bureaucracy in America. It's a wonderful book which goes through and looks at the stories of individual civil servants and how they manage risk for Americans. I think we need to counteract that myth about, the Sir Humphrey of Yes Minister, or Malcolm Tucker of the thick of it.
But the civil service itself is not very good at that.
No, this is exactly it.
Alex, you.
2 points, both very brief, so I'll try and keep them so. The first, the British constitutional system doesn't really help with this task, does it? I mean, parliamentary sovereignty essentially means that a competent government that comes in, whatever the structures that you put in place, can overturn them. And we've seen governments, you referenced yourself the Safety of Rwanda bill, beginning to notice that the use of primary legislation can be very directional. You can essentially tell people what to do and come up with a very long list of things. And it's very difficult to then override that. The other, I think, just in terms of the sort of pursuit of people's good nature towards good governance, you only have to look at something like the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in the previous Parliament to show that actually, again, whatever structure you put in place, that it is meant to be taking power away from the executive can be restored very quickly indeed.
Is there a question?
Well, it's open-ended. I suppose the question is, in the light of that, is there anything that you might suggest beyond the proposals that you've put forward?
No, that's the problem. I have very little faith at the moment about, if a government with a majority wants to come in and do something, it can do it. It's just inertia or distraction by other things that would stop it. That's the worry. I think at the end of it, it's just norms and the agreement by elites to follow those norms, and so we have to find some way to strengthen them.
But inertia or some roadblocks might be worth it.
Yes,
or better than nothing. I think could we run on just for a few?
Yes.
Yeah. So I saw a couple of. Should we take that lady there? And then there was one more over here at the back. Let's take those two, please. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Hannah Keenan from the Institute for Government. I do research on the civil service. This was very interesting. I wanted to pick up on your description just now of the civil service as a kind of sluggish, lumbering beast, not at all responsive. I think often gets mistaken for the guerrilla government that you spoke about earlier. But simultaneously, you said sometimes the civil service can be over-responsive to a new government. Given that the civil service isn't exactly establishing trust in either of those scenarios, do you have any thoughts on what would work now with the current government or with incoming new governments of any colour to re-establish and re-legitimise that sense of trust between ministers and the civil service?
Thank you. And should we take the other one and then you can deal with them how you like?
Thanks very much. Ruth Chambers from an environmental NGO, Green Lions. I'm just wondering to what extent you've thought about the civil service in devolved settings. Certainly the transform scenario that you outlined is more likely to arrive in Wales, for example, more quickly than in England.
Okay, so how to restore trust and impact of...
easy question.
Yeah, I know. Huge question to take right at the end, but...
Can I answer the devolved one better? I mean, in some ways, it seems more interesting to me. as a lawyer, it seems like the Scottish government is slightly better because, well, I think the devolved administrations are slightly better because they're so confined and constrained by law. So they always have to be thinking about law when they're doing anything. So I think that changes the dynamic a lot. They have no choice but to deal with law because everything is determined by statute, right? So in that sense, it's possibly better. But let's see. Your question, God, I mean, you know, I don't have an answer. I mean, it's just, I really don't. I mean, I think we're stuck, really.
But I think you're right. I think the civil service default position will be to try and support the new government and make it work, and that's what the people do. One last one from anyone? Jeff.
Great lecture.
Can you- yeah.
Thank you. Great lecture. I wondered, in your presentation, you seemed to put together, as I understood it, the McNamara type of resistance. We work for the Queen, together with possibly with other forms of resistance, such as refusing to carry out instructions that are lawful. And my sense is that there's a fundamental difference between a minister asking to do something unlawful from a minister asking the person to do something that is unsavory but lawful, and that it's entirely legitimate for the civil servants to refuse in the first case and probably not in the second case. Is that also your impression?
I think so, yeah. I mean, Justice Chamberlain, FDA also said that as well. And, you know, like I was saying, I mean, I don't think it came out that well. Yeah, legality is really the only line that is there, I think. But in a sense, it's derivative on the courts. We can't do it because the court said we can't. The civil service itself has no basis of legitimacy to push back. And so, you know, when you start to look at their other sources of resistance, institutional values, you know, they can say something, but that's the end of it. They can't turn to the courts or Parliament. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, although McNamara I don't think her resistance was motivated by the fear of judicial involvement, but simply as a professional value. And I do think that this limit could be meaningful in a transform government scenario. That's the last.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the questions. I think we'll call it a day there. But thanks again to Ben Yong for a really outstanding lecture. And thank you very much for giving another.